All right, let's talk about the Gospel of Matthew. But we're not just going to look at what it says, we're going to dig into how it's written. We'll be exploring a really fascinating analysis that breaks down 4 key themes the author used to portray Jesus as a king, and it's what makes this gospel account totally distinct from all the others. So, right off the bat, what is it that makes Matthew's gospel so unique? I mean, it shares a ton with Mark and Luke, right? But the thing is, Matthew put his story together with a very specific goal in mind. And today, we're going to unpack exactly what that was. Okay, so first, a little background is probably helpful. You've likely heard Matthew, Mark, and Luke called the Synoptic Gospels. It's a fancy-sounding term, but all it really means is seeing together, because they tell the story of Jesus from a pretty similar angle. Knowing this is key because it really makes you appreciate how intentional Matthew was about the stuff he decided to focus on. All right, let's get into it. The analysis we're looking at today zeroes in on 4 big themes that really define Matthew's gospel. And the very first one is a big one. Matthew is telling the story of a king. And this is no accident. The whole argument here is that Matthew intentionally paints this picture of Jesus with all the traits of a king. You got to remember, he was writing for an audience that was on the edge of their seats, waiting for a monarch. This gospel is basically him saying, okay, everyone, the king is finally here. And you see the evidence for this just woven through the entire book, starting from page 1. Literally. Matthew kicks things off with a genealogy that traces Jesus' royal bloodline all the way back to King David. Then, who shows up? The Magi, asking for the King of the Jews. Boom. That frames the whole story around kingship. It's so direct that the guy on the throne, King Herod, sees this baby as a major political threat. The theme just keeps going, right? He's called the Son of David, his entry into Jerusalem looks just like a king's victory parade, and it all wraps up with the Great Commission, which sounds an awful lot like a final royal command from a king to his subjects. And this all builds to this incredible climax during Jesus' trial. You've got the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, asking him point blank, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus' answer, "You have said so." It just cements this royal identity that Matthew has been carefully building since the very first chapter. Okay, so let's move on to the second theme, because it builds directly on this idea. See, according to Matthew, Jesus isn't just a king. He's the promised king. He's the Messiah everyone's been waiting for. And this theme is all about connecting the dots back to ancient prophecy. All right, check this out. Just one number on the screen, 65. Kind of random, right? What in the world could that possibly have to do with the Gospel of Matthew? Well, get this. That's how many times Matthew quotes or refers back to the Old Testament. 65 times. That's more than Mark, Luke, and John combined. What he's doing is just systematically building this rock-solid case, using prophecy as his evidence, to show his audience, look, Jesus is the fulfillment of everything you've been waiting for. But this brings up a huge, glaring question, doesn't it? If he's the prophesied king, if he's the one who fulfills everything Israel was hoping for, then why on earth was he rejected? And not just by anyone, but by so many of his own people. And that question leads us straight into our third major theme, a story of rejection. You know, Matthew doesn't try to hide this painful contradiction. Nope, he actually leans right into it and makes it a central part of his whole story. This focus on rejection is honestly one of the main things that makes Matthew's gospel feel so different. He doesn't just spring it on you at the end like some surprise twist. Instead, it's this pattern that he weaves through the entire story from beginning to end. And it's not just a pattern, it's one that gets more and more intense. It starts right from his birth. Think about it. His own earthly father, Joseph, almost rejects his mother, and then King Herod tries to kill him as a baby. It keeps going with the execution of the guy who came to announce his arrival, John the Baptist. And it all reaches this heartbreaking peak on the cross, with that cry of feeling completely forsaken by God. But here's the thing. The story doesn't end there with rejection. And this is where we get to our fourth and final theme, the one that provides the ultimate answer, the returning king. So Matthew's gospel is really forward-looking, way more than the others. It actually has more stuff about Jesus' second coming than any other gospel. Chapter 24, for example, is sometimes called like a mini version of all the Bible's prophecies on that topic. And then the very next chapter, chapter 25, is just packed with parables. You know, the 10 virgins, the story of the talents, and they're all laser-focused on one main idea. How do you get ready for the king's return? So, how does this all fit together? You've got the king, the promised Messiah, the story of rejection, and then the final return. Well, it all boils down to one central idea. Jesus wasn't there to set up the kind of kingdom everyone was expecting. And this is where you really see the core conflict, right? It's a total clash between expectation and reality. On one side, you have what people were expecting, a political king for the nation of Israel, someone who would kick out the Romans. But on the other side, you have the reality that Matthew presents, a spiritual king for a people defined by faith, not by borders. And according to this analysis, that huge misunderstanding, that's the reason for the rejection. And this quote just nails it. It brings everything together. Jesus did not come as the king of a physical Israel. He came as the king of his people. That right there is the key that unlocks all four of Matthew's big themes. It's the story of a totally different kind of king who is building a totally different kind of kingdom. So I'll leave you with this to chew on. How does knowing what an author was trying to do, what they wanted to emphasize, what point they were trying to prove, how does that change the way we read their story? Because when you see Matthew's four big themes laid out like this, you realize you're not just reading a biography. You're actually seeing a careful, deliberate argument being made about who this king really was.